Good morning, everyone. We're going to give people a few minutes to load into the call. It just takes a couple minutes for everybody who registered to get into the webinar. So as soon as they're all loaded, we'll get started in just a minute. Good morning. We'll get started in just a moment. We're just giving people a few minutes to load into the webinar. It'll just take a minute or so more, and then we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ken Levinson. I'm the Executive Director of WITA. We hope you are all doing well. It's a rainy day here in Washington, but we know we have many of you coming from around the world, and we love to welcome you to WITA, which hopefully someday in the future we can have you back here again in person live. This is our 6th webinar discussing COVID-19 and trade. DC at least is still closed effectively through mid-May. We probably will be going longer than that, but for now we know through at least mid-May, and we are already planning our next couple webinars. Next week on May 7th, we'll look at the impact of COVID-19 on food security. And on May 14th, our plan is to discuss what the pharmaceutical industry is doing to combat the pandemic, to find vaccines and cures, as well as the trade challenges meeting global demand when supply chains are disrupted. We'll be also announcing some other events that we will be doing in May that are not as COVID specific. So watch your inbox for those. For today, if you're having any trouble with your connection, you can always watch this on our YouTube channel. After the panelists' remarks, we'll try to take some audience questions. If you're watching this on Zoom, you have the ability to ask questions using a Q&A box that's on the bottom of your screen. So if you'll just click on that, you can start adding questions into there. We'll read them off and try to get to as many of those as we can. We really have a great panel today, starting with my co-host in this series of webinars, Wendy Cutler, the Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute. Thank you, Wendy, for joining us again. Today we'll be joined by 4 fantastic guests, 3 of whom we've hosted at live in-person events at WITA in the past, and a 4th who came to us at the recommendation of one of our watchers, of one of our WITA members. So if you have ideas for topics or speakers for our upcoming webinars, please let us know. Welcome back to WITA, Cleet, Scott, and Jean. We're delighted also to welcome Jeff Bosman to the WITA family. Welcome, Jeff. If you've registered for today's Zoom call online, you should have received an email this morning with their biographies and today's event program. Again, after the panelists' remarks and some discussion between the panelists, we'll turn to questions. With that, I'll turn it over to Wendy.
Well, thank you very much, Ken, and welcome to everyone for joining us again. We're always thrilled about the great turnouts we've been getting, and I think this just underscores the interest in this intersection between COVID and trade, and how relevant trade issues are to not only battling the pandemic, but also contributing to the economic recovery. During the past few weeks, we've focused on supply chains, and we've had a lot of discussion about what private companies are doing to adjust their supply chains, both in the short term and the long term. Today, we want to focus more on government policies, and in particular, focus on the Defense Production Act and the Buy American Act, specifically the executive order that we understand is still circulating in the White House for consideration. Before I turn to the speakers, and we have 4 excellent speakers today who just bring a wealth of knowledge to these topics, I just wanted to offer kind of my views on kind of the similarities and differences between the Defense Production Act and the Buy American Act, to kind of help set the stage for our discussion. and particularly focus on the COVID aspect of both of these. I mean, clearly, both of these policies are about addressing concerns about the levels of domestic production of critical and essential goods, particularly in the medical sector. Second, both statutes give important authorities to the president to address these concerns. And three, neither the Defense Production Act nor the Buy American Act are new. They've been around for a long time, but in the COVID world, they've taken on, I think, a new importance. But there are also important differences, and let me just briefly highlight four. First, the Defense Production Act is now being invoked in the context of the COVID world. And just this week, we saw it invoked once more with respect to asking the meat processing facilities to remain open. The Buy American executive order that we'll be discussing is still under consideration. Second, my understanding is that the Defense Production Act invocation will be temporary, while a Buy American executive order could be in place for the foreseeable future. Third, the scope of both of these statutes and their use in the COVID world are different. Up until now, last week, we would have said, no, they're both in the medical area with respect to medical equipment, PPE, medicines. But again, this week has shown the willingness of the administration to use the DPA in other sectors like agriculture. And four, and last, with respect to the relationship with trade, I think the Defense Production Act really focuses more on export restrictions, while Buy America looks more at restricting imports, or at least making imports less competitive. So we have an incredible panel to kind of discuss all of these issues and really help us understand where these statutes and the use of these statutes stand, or for the Buy America executive order where it stands, and just gain a better understanding of what the implications of the uses are. We have four panelists. I'm going to ask each one of them to try and limit their comments to no more than 7 minutes, and I'll need to interrupt if you go longer. I'd like to start with my colleague, Cleet Wilhelms. I had the honor to work with Cleet closely at USTR, and as many of you know, he then went on to the White House. So he is well positioned to offer, I think, a great perspective on how we got here. What is the thinking in the White House? Some of us remember when it came to Buy America, some of these ideas were circulating very early on in the Trump administration. And so I hope Cleet can also comment on whether these policies are really an extension of what of the policies and thinking in the White House with respect to onshoring, bringing jobs back, et cetera. Have these policies gotten a new boost or a new meaning in the COVID world, as we're all focusing on coping with shortages in PPE and over-reliance on certain trading partners, including China? So Cleet, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Thank you, Ken, and thank you everyone for listening today. Wendy, I really do like the way that you frame the issue. And one of the questions I keep getting from clients is, how has the coronavirus changed the trade agenda? And my answer is, not as much as you think. And I'll remind people, remember before COVID, when this administration was very focused on Buy America policies. Remember before COVID, when this administration was very focused on policies that would involve intervening in the economy in a way to bring more production back to the United States. Remember before COVID, when certain members of this administration were trying to lower tariffs. We're fighting against some of these policies. And remember when we had this really strong policy against China, and when we expressed a lot of frustration about the WTO and the GPA. So I think it's really important to think about things this way, because what you realize is that I don't think we're seeing necessarily a new phenomena. Rather, what we're really seeing is just an acceleration of ongoing trends. And I would say these are trends not only in the United States, but around the globe. You have a lot of countries around the world who were previously expressing concerns about trade, and you see those same countries now imposing, export controls or imposing taxes on digital companies in the middle of this crisis to try to pay for some of the stimulus. And so again, this is a trend that I think is accelerated but isn't new. Now, what can we learn from this in policymaking? I think what it underscores is the importance to focus on the long term and to deal with these issues as we were before, and not to overreact and come up with short-term, not well thought out policies. And let me apply that thinking to three different areas today, with some of which are the primary focus of this conversation. The first one I want to start with is China. And I think we all have reason to be incredibly frustrated with China right now. If not for the lack of transparency about the coronavirus, well, then we have a right to be frustrated with China for the long-term unfair practices that it's engaged in, for the lack of respect on human rights and free markets and the principles that we hold dear. And that's understandable, but I think we need to be very careful with the kind of rhetoric we're using. Let's not peddle conspiracy theories. Let's be very honest about the problems with the party and with their policies as it applies to trade in other areas. Let's be strategic. Let's not see who can come up with the quickest policy and the strongest short-term answer to China. Let's have long-term strategic answers that think through the second and third order effects and are truly targeted at solving our problems with China. And finally, let's find a way to globally pressure China to change instead of trying to do this all on our own. Let me apply this to the Buy America executive order. The first thing I'd say on that is in this environment, we need to be very careful with the facts. One of the talking points that I've seen out there is that 80%, our industry relies on China for 80% of its active pharmaceutical ingredients. And actually, the truth is that it's 13%. Most of the stuff that we need comes from either other places or from the United States. And if you look at the World Health Organization's essential medicines list, which is the subject of this executive order, 21% of the items on there are the active pharmaceutical ingredients from the US, compared with only 15% to China. So again, maybe there is some concern about China's reliance as a trading partner, but let's not overstate it. Let's make sober policy decisions based on the facts. And in terms of what we want to do, I'm very worried about the executive order. I think it's not realistic to think that you can make everything at home. I've been troubled somewhat by some of the administration talking points saying we can't rely on other countries. I think it's fair to say we need to revisit our relationship with China, but instead of saying we're going to try to do everything at home, which I just don't think is realistic, let's look at regionalization. Let's look at trusted supply chains with allies, very similar to what we're talking about in the 5G space. Just as in 5G, we realize we can't do everything in America. On things like pharmaceuticals, let's also look for global, secure, trusted supply chains with allies. Let's look at stockpiling. I think that's another example of what would be a better policy. And then the third thing I'll add here is I do think the US needs to look more broadly at industrial policies. The ITIF and Rob Atkinson have done a lot of great writing about this. And a lot of what he's talking about is not discrimination against others to promote US technology, but it's having the government play a role and identifying clearly what are the technologies we need to be more competitive on, and then looking at how do we create incentives through the tax code, through subsidies and other means. And I do think that those are better ways to approach this. And the last thing I'll say on the executive order is, I think it's very telling that not only are the pharmaceutical companies who you would expect to be opposed, not only have they come out against this, but so have the generic producers, because they are worried about the raised possible cost increases for the United States and the impact that will have on the US healthcare system. The last thing I want to talk about here, and I'll turn it back over so I don't go over my 7 minutes, is the WTO. And I think the Trump administration has rightfully been very concerned about the WTO for a long time, has felt that it isn't achieving its objectives. And I think that has been clearly seen in what has happened in response to the coronavirus. Members around the world are enacting policies and not really worrying about what the WTO thinks about them. The WTO hasn't stepped forward and played the role that I think it needs to do. And so that is a legitimate concern, but I think we need to be careful in our responses. I don't think disengagement, backing away, pulling out is the way to go. On the GPA in particular, I worry very much that if the US pulls out, China exceeds, what have we done? We've created a scenario where China now has an advantage vis-a-vis US companies in fighting for 5G contracts around the world. And I don't want to see that. What I want to end with, though, on the WTO, and I think it's a helpful quote, and it's from someone who's considered to be on the more hawkish side of the spectrum, very close to this administration, and that's Michael Pillsbury. And when he talks about the WTO in his book, The 100-Year Marathon, he talks very clearly about what China is trying to do with the WTO. They are trying to weaken it because they see it as a mechanism that advances U.S. free market ideals. And what he says, and I'll read this quote: "If China succeeds in weakening the United Nations and the WTO, it will be in keeping with its goal of creating a new world order by first delegitimizing the old one." And that's exactly what I'm talking about. Let's be frustrated with China. Let's be frustrated with our ability to produce all the advanced technologies that we need. Let's be frustrated with the WTO, but let's be smart and think long-term, not panic and overreact to a short-term crisis, because these are long-term problems and they deserve long-term solutions. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Cleet. You've certainly put a lot of issues on the table, including industrial policy, the WTO. I thought your comments is something I did want to get at. It's during this discussion, and that is with respect particularly to medicines and ingredients. We're seeing so many different statistics being used trying to demonstrate our over-reliance on China. And I do agree with you that we really need to understand the facts, where our vulnerabilities may lie, and then a thoughtful policy on how to deal with them. Now I'm going to turn to Jeff. And Jeff, you are billed as like one of the experts in the United States on the Defense Production Act. Many of us in the trade world really didn't know a lot about this until last month. And then I, for one, was pretty astonished to read that the Defense Production Act, at least parts of it, have been used like tens of thousands of times by previous administrations. So I would hope that in your remarks, you can just give us a brief overview of the DPA. Given this is a trade group, I think there'll be a lot of interest in how the DPA relates to export restrictions, because we did see FEMA regulations following the invocation of DPA spelling out export restrictions on medical ventilators, masks, and gloves. Mm-hmm. And then perhaps you can also touch upon this, whether we're going to see further use of DPA, not just with respect to the medical sector. Now we're seeing it being used in the food sector. Is this a new pattern, and is there any precedent for these types of actions that we've seen, particularly this week? Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. As I said, I'll start with a brief primer on the DPA and then address some of these recent actions and prognostications. Overall, the DPA gives very broad authority to mobilize domestic industry in support of national defense. It was modeled on World War II era authorities that FDR used to great effect during that war. The DPA allows the government to shape national defense preparedness programs, define broadly, and take steps to maintain and enhance the domestic industrial base. Congress periodically has to reauthorize the statute, and they most recently did so in 2018. The DPA has three key authorities to bear in mind. Taking them slightly out of sequence, Title VII allows the president to block certain foreign-backed transactions and investments that threaten national security. This is the basis for CFIUS review, which many, I'm sure, are familiar with. It also has a safe harbor from antitrust laws that allows industry to engage in discussions that could otherwise be considered anti-competitive. Title I of the DPA, more prominent these days, that governs priorities and allocations. And these authorities allow the president to require companies to prioritize fulfillment of government orders and also to allocate or control the distribution of materials and services. Wendy, as you mentioned, priorities are extremely common. Allocations are not. Priorities allow the government to issue so-called rated orders. These orders are coded such that performance of those contracts be prioritized above commercial or standard non-rated government contracts. Allocations, on the other hand, are actions to control the distribution of material. They're more rare in part because they're designed to be a fallback when the priorities authority is insufficient. Title I is not unlimited. For example, it cannot be used to compel contracts of employment. It also cannot generally be used for wage or price controls absent explicit congressional authorization. The Commerce Department administers the regulations for the defense priorities and allocation system. And the Assistant Secretary for Export Administration is the appeal authority to decide requests for adjustments or exceptions to those priority orders. Final part of the DPA to bear in mind is Title III. This governs the expansion of capacity and supply. And this segment allows the president to use economic incentives to support the domestic industrial base and to expand production and supply of critical materials and goods. These authorities are used when the president determines that the domestic industrial capabilities either don't exist at all, at risk of being lost, or otherwise insufficient to meet certain essential needs. The Defense Department operates a standing Title III office within the Office of the Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment. Undersecretary Ellen Lord has been taking point within the DoD to coordinate the defense industrial response to COVID-19. The DoD Title III office has a portfolio of about 32 projects at the end of 2018. They're generally not publicized, but they're referred to in broad terms. They run the gamut from everything from seawater batteries and sonobuoys to specialty chemicals from missiles. So again, to your point, an authority that has been widely used, if somewhat under the radar. I want to pause for a moment on the term domestic that I've used a few times now. In the context of the DPA, domestic is slightly broader than just the United States. So a quote domestic source in the DPA is one that performs in the United States or Canada substantially all of the R&D, engineering, manufacturing, and production on a contract, and procures substantially all the components and assemblies required from US or Canadian companies. Within the defense world, there's also a related concept of security of supply agreements that the United States has with a few other allies. These allow the United States and these countries to request priority treatment for defense orders from each other's firms. They're non-binding, but it's a variation of the defense priorities and allocation system. With that background, let me shift quickly to a few of the recent executive and legislative actions involving the DPA to help make sense of some of the headlines. On March 18th, the president issued a DPA executive order. In part, it appears designed to make a broad omnibus finding that the presidential pre-approval requirements under the DPA have already been met with respect to certain resources needed to fight COVID-19. You see in a number of these DPA authorizations and orders the delegation to other secretaries. That's contemplated by the statutory structure, that it's not just the Commerce Department or the president making all of these particular orders. It can be the Secretary of Homeland Security, HHS, or as we saw in the meat packing issue, the Secretary of Agriculture. On March 27th, the CARES Act was signed into law, and that appropriated $1 billion for DPA purchases by the Defense Department. That was a relatively significant injection of cash into that program. It also temporarily waived the requirement for congressional approval of projects above 50 million. And it also waives an associated waiting period that requires 30 days advance notice to Congress for those projects. On April 3rd, we saw, as you mentioned, Wendy, the high-profile case of the Allocation Authority. And this was essentially the president directing FEMA to allocate to domestic use certain respirators, masks, and personal protective equipment, or PPE. This was essentially an export ban, as it was initially written. A few days later, we saw CBP publish some guidance that softened the allocation somewhat. CBP emphasized that its focus is on large, what they call commercial quantities, in this case, meaning orders of 2,500 or more and containing more than 10,000 units of those gloves and masks and commodities. It also emphasized that exports would be allowed within North America, to Canada and Mexico, and it would allow exports by charities and government agencies. So again, we saw a little bit of the softening of what was initially a rather draconian statement. On April 10th, DoD received approval from the White House for its first COVID-19 Title III investment. This was a significant one. It was $133 million for N95 mask production, split between 3 companies. Yesterday and today, we saw another Title III action used to bolster testing swab production from a company in Maine. And earlier this week, of course, we learned that meat and poultry are, quote, scarce and critical material essential to the national defense, when the president directed the Secretary of Agriculture to use DPA authorities to ensure the continuation of the meat supply. One final word on Title III implementation before I wrap up. This is not a program like the CARES Act loans where companies simply apply for funds. But DoD's Title III office is certainly receptive to proactive outreach from industry. Companies who wish to help and have a solution can contact DoD through the Joint Acquisition Task Force online portal and arrange a pitch. Wendy, you asked one question about some of the trends that we've seen, both in the subject matter of the DPA and the extent to which export controls could be implicated. In terms of trends, I think what we saw from yesterday and today's announcement in Maine, I wouldn't be surprised to see more Title III action for these consumable components to support testing and treatment. Along the lines of what we've seen from masks and swabs. There are certain components of respirators too that are essentially designed to be one-time use. You can see additional work under Title III to sustain that production. From the export controls perspective, you certainly have a lot of expertise since Commerce owns these.
30 more seconds.
Sure.
On to the next.
And I will wrap up. In short, I don't see an immediate follow-on for export controls. I think the 3M FEMA experience shows how quickly those antibodies are triggered. As Cleet mentioned, it's maybe not an existential threat, but it's certainly a substantial risk when other countries may control certain portions of the supply chain. And I think there is some hesitation before implicating a authority that could invite retaliation. With that, I'm happy to address any questions later on, but I'll pass the mic back to you all.
This is extremely useful. Thank you very much. We'll probably get to more questions during our Q&A period on the DPA. If I can turn now to Scott Paul, you have been an advocate for Buy America, and I think you've made a compelling case why this is in the US interest, particularly given our over-reliance on many other countries, but also the notion of during COVID, we're experiencing shortages, et cetera. Maybe we need to be doing more to boost our manufacturing base. So I would be grateful if you can make the case for Buy America and maybe respond to some of the concerns that Cleet raised, as well as concerns from other quarters that perhaps we'd be shooting ourselves in the foot if we were to go ahead and impose Buy America restrictions, particularly at a time when we are in such need of medical supplies, PPE, and related medical equipment from other countries. Over to you, Scott.
Wendy, thank you very much. Ken and WITA, thank you for this opportunity. Wendy, fabulous framing there, and I I greatly respect and appreciate the remarks by Clayton, Jeff, to frame the DPA and some of these other issues. When we look at this, I want to break it down into 4 components. First, is there a problem that could be solved by the application of some sort of domestic preference or Buy America executive order or action? I think the answer is clearly yes. With respect to some of the data on our reliance for imports, there's data that supports every point of view on this, but there is no disputing that for some critical active pharmaceutical ingredients, for some critical parts, for some critical supplies, that we are entirely overdependent on China and some other countries as well. And that's not a terrific or fantastic position to be in when we're facing the need to surge our own production or respond to a crisis. Second, I think it's important to understand that while global cooperation in all of this is certainly ideal, this crisis has largely demonstrated that each and every country is going to act in its own interest. You have seen dozens upon dozens of export bans or de facto export bans. You saw Beijing take early action to guarantee its own supply at the expense of other countries. And I think it would be naive to suggest that everybody is going to act as we move forward in some sort of harmonic effort to maximize the opportunities for cooperation. Certainly, we should grasp them when they are available, but I don't think that we should count on them at all. And I think that this crisis has emphasized that. And I think the next point there is we have eroded our domestic capacity to quickly scale up or to effectively have an ecosystem for many of these types of products. There are complicated reasons for that, but one of them is kind of the Walmartization of medical supplies and how you have these group purchasing organizations that squeeze costs out of suppliers, leaving them no choice but to ship their production to China and other low-wage countries. And certainly that's where there can be a public policy solution that helps to level the scales there. A last point I want to make with respect to is there a problem? I would say absolutely. And I think that we need to look forward. There is a real possibility in the future of further pandemics, of biological weapons attacks, of attacks on the electrical grid, on cyber attacks, or unanticipated natural disasters that may disrupt supply chains. And in each and every one of these cases, I think that there's adequate demonstration that we have a very limited domestic capacity to adequately respond, whether it's to rebuilding electrical transformers with domestic electrical steel, or again, supplying PPEs and other necessary equipment to respond to a pandemic. And I think the last thing here, and I have great respect for what Cleet said about Beijing, and I completely agree with him that some of the rhetoric has been over the top about China. I also want to clearly emphasize that in their own words and actions, the Chinese government has clearly demonstrated that it's going to seek to exploit a crisis like this to gain leverage and to undermine the United States, even while talking more broadly about the need for cooperation and the types of assistance that it can provide. I want to shift next to, from a public policy perspective, whether this would be unusual or typical. And I would argue that it would be quite typical. The Buy American Act originally was enacted in the midst of the Great Depression as a response to kind of maximize the utilization of public investment to create jobs. Obviously, the arsenal of democracy and the measures that Jeff referenced during World War II, the DPA as a ramp up to production during the Korean War, even the Section 232 authorities that were enacted as part of the Trade Expansion Act in 1962 were guided as a check on surges of imports that could impact national security. Look, you can take that even up to the Recovery Act in 2009, where there was a Buy America provision, Section 1605, that was enacted as part of the last Recovery Act during the Great Recession. So it would not at all be unusual to see some additional domestic preferences enacted with respect to a response to this crisis. And as I think that others may argue as well, we do have great authority to do this. We've made many reservations under the GPA, and I'm sure that Jean may mention many of those, or under our trade agreements that would permit us to do this. So this is well within our authority and our ability to do. Finally, I want to emphasize this is not only a concern that the administration has, and that, you know, even last year there was legislation introduced in the Congress both to strengthen through Buy America or other purchasing the ability to reshore some medical supplies and pharmaceuticals. Just yesterday, the Senate Democrats, virtually all of them, introduced a bill that would federalize the medical supply chain. And there's going to be similar legislation introduced in the House of Representatives. So this is by no means unusual or particular to the administration at this point. I think there is broad support for engaging and for taking action, and for some Buy America. The caution I will say is that many times the administration has spoken about Buy America policies. I recall the first week of the administration that there was going to be an energy pipeline executive order that was going to require the purchase of domestic pipe. Never materialized. There have been 2 Buy America executive orders the administration has put forth. Neither one of them has resulted in a meaningful or substantive change or outcomes in policy. They've been largely viewed as guidelines rather than obligations. And so I think that in this case, it may well be that they are more rhetorical in nature than practical. And I think that that would be a missed opportunity and a mistake. And finally, one point on cooperation. I believe that it would enhance US collaboration. It would achieve our foreign policy objectives if we were once again in the position of being a donor country rather than a donee country for critical medical supplies during a pandemic. We're not in the position to give help to a lot of developing countries, in part because we lack the capacity to produce these ourselves. And if we were to return or to restore some of that capacity, it certainly would better situate us to achieve some of these foreign policy goals as well. I will pause there, and I want to again thank Wendy for her able moderation of this.
Thank you, Scott. I think you made a great case for invoking the Buy America Act, but I'm sure our next speaker is probably going to highlight some concerns about what that would mean. Jean, you worked on the government procurement agreement for many years at USTR as the lead negotiator. One question I just ask you, if indeed we were to go ahead and proceed with a Buy America order in the medical field, and we said then to other countries, look, let us renegotiate our coverage, how do you think they would respond? Do you think they would counter retaliate, or do you think that they would work with us? Scott made the point that a lot of other countries have been imposing export restrictions in this area. So a lot of countries are looking at their own interest here. And then more broadly, I would just ask your views on the government procurement agreement, just more generally. And the question is, because it's been under so much attack by this administration as not really providing the type of benefits that were anticipated, whether you think, or can you make the case why the government procurement agreement remains important for the United States to continue its membership?
Okay, thanks, Wendy and Ken. Okay, starting first with the proposed Buy American executive order that would cover medical and pharmaceutical. I mean, I think first the question is, what is it trying to accomplish and who is it targeted at? Because if it's targeted at China, you know, under the Trade Agreements Act of '79, China's already prohibited from engaging in US procurement unless there's non-availability or unreasonableness of price or other or public interest. So the prohibition is there to say any country that's not a GPA or FTA partner cannot sell to the US government if it's above $180,000. So below 180,000, you have obviously the Buy American Act, which kicks in. So one of the questions is whether or not you could tinker with the Buy American Act local content requirements if you're really trying to focus on China. The president has suggested that you could increase the amount of local content that would be needed for domestic content that would be needed for a product to be considered domestic. I mean, so that's one issue. But looking at it from the trade, side, under the GPA and FTAs, the U.S. covers the agencies that buy the medical products and the pharmaceuticals. So if we impose a new Buy American requirement, that would not be consistent with our obligations. So what the US could do, obviously, is first it could propose, and it would probably want to propose modifications of its schedules to say we're going to exclude these products from the coverage, or we're going to impose a Buy America requirement on them. So you could have, I think you would have a limited amount of changes in our GPA coverage. Now, how would the other countries respond? Chances are, since they're going to be looking at losing access to US markets, they're going to say to the US, then why should you have access to ours in these same areas? Because the US obviously exports a lot of medical products and pharmaceuticals to other countries. So they could easily, if they chose, to put in place sort of equivalent measures that would say, we'll put Buy America or domestic, measures into place in their own countries. But, I think we have to look more broadly, because most countries, the US is the GPA party that has the most Buy American policies, the most Buy American exclusions. So other countries have not taken that course. And I think that's going to be one of the challenges, is that most countries first would not have measures in place to do anything immediate. But I think you could expect to see actions taken in which, if we're going to close out certain parts of our market, they would respond in kind. But one of the things, and I think, and Scott mentioned this, he mentioned the Recovery Act. In the Recovery Act, they added a new Buy American requirement that applied to all federally funded infrastructure projects, but they excluded all the GPA and the FTA partners. So clearly one option for this Buy American executive order would be to say, okay, if China is our target, then we're going to exclude our GPA and FTA partners from it. So that would be one option. And if not, then I think the question would be, what is the US prepared to face in terms of losing access to other markets? But let me go on to the broader question, I think, of the GPA. And there's been a lot of discussion in the administration about whether the GPA is worth it, whether we should withdraw. And so let me just look at what we would lose if the US pulls out of the GPA. First, we'd lose access to the procurement of 47 countries or economies. Now, we have FTAs with 5 of them, with Canada only until July 1st, when the USMCA goes into effect, because under that the new NAFTA, or the NAFTA replacement, Canada has been excluded from the procurement chapter. So once NAFTA successor goes into place, then we will no longer have access to Canadian procurement unless we have the GPA. Second, the Korea FTA only covers central government entities, and the Israel FTA only covers goods and central government entities, which leaves the 2 other FTAs that are sort of full blown, which are Singapore and Australia. So, one, we'd lose access to that. Second, and this, I think, and Cleet mentioned this, when China joins the GPA, they're in their 12th year of negotiations and they're getting closer. The question is going to be, if we pull out, then we lose any opportunity to influence what they cover under the GPA. But more importantly, we're going to lose access to their market. Because if the US is not a party to the GPA, then they're not going to be giving US access to their market. And this leads to what I think is really the biggest concern, is if the US leaves the GPA and thinks that they're going to recover access through bilateral agreements, they may be able to negotiate, federal government, procurement coverage or central government procurement coverage in the other countries. But what they're going to lose is subcentral access. Under the GPA, the US covers 37 states. And they do so, and they did so back in the early 1990s by saying to the states, we want you to agree to be covered. 37 states said yes. And I think it's absolutely impossible that they're ever going to get those 37 states to come back in and say, yes, we want to join another agreement. The last time the US went out to ask states to join an FTA, they got 8 responses. So I think what's going to happen is if the US pulls out and they try to negotiate bilateral agreements, what you're going to have is they're going to have central government, federal government exchanges of procurement, but we're going to lose access to the subcentral level. And what you're going to see, I think, also is you're going to see retaliation. There may be some retaliation on a Buy America, executive order, but that's going to be minor to what you're going to see if you have pull out.
Hello, Jean. We're losing.
That's a reciprocity law that says.
We just lost you there. Can I just ask you if you can just wrap up then, because we have a lot of questions in about 15 more minutes.
Okay. I'm not sure where you lost me, but I think the point is that you're going to see retaliation by the other countries if we pull out the GPA. And I'll just stop there.
Okay. So I think you did a good job, and the 2 key losses are loss of those markets and then the risk of retaliation by other countries, right, including the whole issue about if China exceeds to the GPA, what that means as well for us if we were to leave. I'm going now. I hope to ask some questions, but that's not going to happen. I'm going to now turn to Ken, who's been monitoring the great questions from our great audience. So Ken, let me turn it over to you, and let's see if we can get a lot of those questions in the last 15 minutes. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Super informative. This is not an area that WITA has spent a lot of time on in recent years, so really appreciate your helping us understand some of these important issues in this context. Going through the questions, there's sort of 3 main buckets, try to hit in 3 sets of questions, one having to do with USMCA, the new US-Mexico-Canada agreement, some China-related questions, and then some more specific things about the DPA. So the first question sort of goes to, I think, Cleet and Scott first, and then maybe we'll turn to Jeff related to USMCA about the impact of these Buy American provisions on the new USMCA, and which is going into effect in the next few weeks. Could there be maybe more of a Buy North American approach in policy? Would that make sense in this context? And then, to Jeff about other countries that may have supply agreements with the U.S. and could be considered domestic under DPA. Is that a thing? Cleet had mentioned about working with allies. The president has sometimes said that Europe is sometimes an ally and sometimes he says they're a rival. So would they even qualify under something like that? But let's start with that USMCA question and maybe this idea of maybe Buy North American.
I mean, I can kick it off, Scott, if that works for you. Look, I want to make a broader point on Buy America because I think it relates to this question, and that's, as I heard Scott talking, it was almost amazing to me how much I agreed with him. I agreed with his diagnosis of the problem, and I agreed with a lot of his objectives in terms of making sure that we have supplies, we have domestic production capability where we need it. I think we agree on that. Where we differ is on the solution, and I simply just don't think discrimination is the answer. I don't think it is ever realistic for us to produce everything at home that we need. And so that leads me to the conclusion that we need to figure out a way to have these trusted supply chains and networks. Now, again, Buy North America, maybe that's one way to do it. But again, you still have this discrimination vis-a-vis others outside of North America. So I would rather look at ways to cooperate, coordinate, incentives, deregulation as the means to promote those kinds of supply chains rather than simply saying we're going to discriminate. One last point I just want to make on the pharmaceutical industry, and it's that, again, we can say these are the facts, or those are the facts, and people have different facts. But the reality is we still make most of the innovative drugs in the United States. Our pharmaceutical industry is much more innovative than the rest of the world. Part of the problem we have is that consumers in other countries don't pay the full value of those drugs. So again, if we want to promote more innovation, let's make sure that our companies are fairly compensated around the world. Those are the kinds of approaches I would lean towards to have a more vibrant pharmaceutical industry rather than discrimination.
Let me just add to that, I do think that there's the potential for a preference arrangement that could be North American. Point out the Section 1605 from the Recovery Act, there was a special arrangement reached with Canada with respect to that. So again, it would not at all be unusual to have some regional exception or inclusion with respect to domestic preferences. And I think that the fact that we do have a USMCA entering into force soon and that there was a negotiation would provide a pretty good framework for that. So I absolutely think that would be explored. Again, I do believe that there are not many areas where you can say that there is a national security, health security imperative for having a domestic source. I believe this is absolutely one of them. And so I do think that there certainly, we should leverage the massive domestic public investment market we have, particularly in pharmaceuticals with VA purchases, DoD purchases, Medicaid, et cetera, that could be incredibly powerful in reshoring some of these supply chains.
And Jeff, you were going to mention something. We were asking about the list of, I don't know, we call them trusted countries.
Right. So just to clarify, the text of the statute of the DPA defines domestic by reference to the US and Canada. There are 8 other countries who have these security of supply agreements, which are non-binding arrangements, but which establish a process to request priority acceptance and performance across borders. And those countries are Australia, Finland, Italy, Norway, the Netherlands, Spain, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. Within those, the Norwegian one is the most recent. The Australian and British reflect similar to the national technology and industrial base construct, some preferential treatment along with Canada that those 4 members of the Five Eyes enjoy. But just to reiterate, that wouldn't change the definition of domestic under the DPA for those countries. It's simply a bilateral agreement to expedite some consideration for certain defense-related contracts.
And I'm going to, next part question, sort of going to come back to Jeff a little bit more, dig in a little more, and then actually I want to bounce over to Wendy, actually. I'm going to pretend you're a panelist for a second and ask a China Phase 1 deal, because you know that as well as anyone, Wendy. But Jeff, I guess it's a 2-part question. It's coming in a couple of different ways in our chat, asking about whether or not the president has authority to force a plant open. Where does that limit, where is that limit? And, for example, and, related to that, could he halt exports to China for a company like a Chinese-owned Smithfield, which is, of course, the ones that's closed.
Right.
And then if you did that, wouldn't that then impact, Wendy, on Phase 1? And I know you've got a lot of thoughts, and you've shared in some of your Asia Society work about your expectations on what's happening on Phase 1. I just think those are 2 sort of questions about both DPA, but then also what impact that might have on U.S.-China relations overall. And Cleet, you certainly probably have views on that based on all your extensive work on that front.
Sure, I'll take it first and go in reverse order there. So certainly the allocation authority is quite broad, and if there were a desire to restrict exports, that could certainly be an allocation to domestic use. Now, whether that's advisable or whether it would go crosswise with other trade policy negotiations is a substantial question. So whether it's allowable and advisable, I think, are 2 different questions in that analysis. The first question as to what the constraints are, at some point you can't get blood from a stone, right? So simply invoking the Defense Production Act, as we mentioned, can't compel employment. So if there are circumstances where a company is physically unable to fulfill an order, even a rated order or an allocation directive, they are actually required to notify the government that they are not able to meet those requirements. What you can't do is choose to reprioritize your own commercial order over the government order. But if you simply can't meet it, full stop, that's certainly a valid response. And then it's a matter of discussion with the government as to what the next step would be. I saw a question come in too related about can the president simply seize these factories along the lines of the steel seizure cases, for those who want a flashback to constitutional law classes. The short answer is no. And in fact, in the steel seizure cases itself, one of the concurring opinions highlighted the fact, they cited the Defense Production Act, which was quite new at the time. And they said because it provides for certain labor negotiation rights that the president has, but does not say anything about simply seizing control, then President Truman in that case acted beyond the scope of his authority, either under the Defense Production Act or under Article 2.
Thank you. Wendy, any thoughts on the intersection on these initiatives and supplying the domestic market and maybe undermining China Phase 1?
Maybe you can make that argument, but I think that's just, if that's our biggest problem with China, then that would be something we could live with. I think that the Phase 1 implementation is going well, relatively, particularly on the rules side. The purchases don't seem to be on track. I think that, China is clearly is monitoring what we're doing in these areas, but Jean pointed out that China is not a signatory to the government procurement agreement, so that doesn't give them a lot of rights there. Overall, I think that China is probably, when it looks at our array of policy tools, is a lot more concerned this week about the announcement on new export controls. I did want to make just one small point on your question on the USMCA, and just let's all remember that with respect to government procurement, USMCA is NAFTA minus. So if anything, we're taking government procurement access away from Canada and Mexico. And so, this notion now, if we're talking about the idea of having like a regional procurement agreement with them, I think we're talking about a renegotiation of USMCA, and it might be premature to be doing that.
It kind of teed up a question I was just about to ask and pose towards Jean. There's the potential threat of the U.S. pulling out of the GPA. What would that mean for those 37 states? Are they automatically pulled out with the United States, or is there some residual ability that they would have to continue intersecting with the GPA?
If the U.S. pulls out, then they would have no obligations under the GPA. There's 37 states also covered under the Singapore and Chile FTAs. So they would still have obligations there. And then there's any number of the 37 that have obligations under other FTAs, 31 under Australia, less so under Morocco, and far less under some of the Latin American agreements. So they would not have obligations to, to Europe and Japan or to most of the other major players.
Thanks. So we're going to wrap up in just a minute, and we've apologies, we'll probably run just a couple minutes long. I'm going to start with Jeff, and then I'm going to come back to Cleet and any of the others who want to weigh in. So Jeff, it's a very specific question I'm going to ask you. Reading it, I'm going to read it just directly because I don't want to get it wrong.
Okay.
It comes from Amy Porges, who many of us know. Do the defense MOUs between DoD and various countries apply to DoD contracts under Title III in the sense of treating content from MOU partners as if it were US content for the purposes of Buy America? And I know you can read it too. And then I want to come back it's sort of a little directing it towards CLEAT, but also I think Scott will certainly have a view on this as well. But what is all of this? And when I say all of this, I'm saying the disruptions in global supply chains that are happening now, Buy American provisions, utilization of DPA. What does this mean for global supply chains? There's certainly been an effort by this administration that they've been fairly explicit about reshoring and bringing more of production back to the United States. Do we see this accelerating after the crisis is over, or as we're moving out of the worst parts of it? Or are we going to be seeing some returning back to pre-COVID supply chains? What are your views on what both you're seeing and what you think should happen? Jeff, let's go back to you first on that very specific question that I know you could read back to, and then Scott and Clete on that other supply chains question.
Got it. So with apologies, I'm going to dodge a little bit on this one, in that I don't want to opine on the particularities of the Buy American Act, because the way that U.S. content is measured there is a pretty complicated analysis. I would just say that the MOU, the agreements that are in place with respect to the DPA are administered through the same Title III DoD office. So to the extent that companies have a requirement for a product that comes from one of the countries with one of those agreements, the reference for assistance in proceeding with those and getting them is through the Title III office in DoD. So with apologies for not going into the details of Buy American, I don't want to get out too far over my skis there.
Appreciate your discretion. Thank you. Clete, Scott?
Yeah, so look, on the supply chain issue, I think it is inevitable that for certain products, certain types of technologies, there is going to be somewhat of a severing of those supply chains with China. I think it's inevitable. I don't think it's going to be necessarily a complete decoupling, but I think on sensitive goods, we are going to go more towards a trusted, secure supply chain model. We may look more towards regionalization. And I think that you see a little bit of that happening already, and I think you're going to see more of it, because I do think a lot of companies are just worried about this growing US-China dynamic, and it's hard to bet on that. I think we need to try to keep the linkages where we can, while recognizing it may not be possible to do it on all different types of goods and services. Now, I want to touch just on one thing. I saw there was a question about, is Europe part of this answer? And I would say absolutely, they need to be. The US and Europe do need to find a way to be both part of the solution together. But what I would say is, a lot of this conversation always gets framed as, why would Europe work with the US? They always say nasty things about us, and they do bad things and discriminate against us. And the reality is it has to go both ways. I think we can probably do a better job with some of our language and some of the ways we've treated them, but the same is also true. Europe needs to pay our pharmaceutical companies for their innovation, as we were talking about earlier. They need to stop taxing tech. And they need to be more ambitious on China and on WTO reform. And so it goes both ways. I think we can both do a better job of working with each other, but ultimately we have to be part of the same solution. We helped create this international trading system together. We have the most to lose if it falls apart, and we need to figure out how to put our differences aside and build it back together. Because as I said in my opening remarks, if we don't do that, I think China wins. And that is troubling to me.
I do think that there will be robust efforts to look at reshoring, particularly critical supply chains, along with more generally supply chains. You see this obviously from some administration actions and rhetoric before COVID-19, as Clete mentioned. The fact that I'm a Labor Democrat, wrote the same opinion piece as Marco Rubio about the need for industrial policy and reshoring, and that we know that this is an item that certainly many Senate Republicans want to look at as well. It indicates to me that this is going to be part of the conversation for a long time. And I would just quickly add that we are not alone. I mean, the Japanese government has publicly stated and has put together a fund to reshore some production from China. India, the government in India has stated the same thing. And so this is not a uniquely American thought here, but will it become a complete decoupling? I don't know the answer to that, and as Clete indicated, I don't think he does either. But I do think that this will help to accelerate the trend, and you will see this be an increasingly important part of the public policy conversation as we move ahead as well.
Well, with that, Wendy, any final words?
Just a big thanks to our panelists. I think this panel just really rich in substance. We got different views on the table. And so my gratitude to all of you, and also to the viewers. A number of you had proposed this as a topic for our discussion. So keep your ideas coming to us, and we'll do our best to be positive and try to address the issues that you raise and want us to raise and get speakers to speak on. Thank you.
Thanks, Wendy. Thank you, Jeff, Jean, Scott, Clete. Really appreciate your joining us today. Thanks to all of you who stayed with us. You're clicking out, but as we do want to remind you to join us again on May 7th and the 14th. On the 7th, we'll be addressing food security. We hope to announce those panelists in the next day or so. And then we'll be addressing pharmaceutical supply chains issues and some of the things that the pharmaceutical industry is doing to try to accelerate cures to the market. So thanks, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you all again soon.